That time I just stood there and bled while I waited for my boss to acknowledge my existence. I just got a nosebleed for the first time in a while, and it reminded me of this story. I got them fairly often as a kid, but less so as an adult. One day, while I'm in the office, I get a pretty profuse nosebleed. I tried to just plug it up and keep going about my day, but this one was lasting, so I head over to my boss's desk to let her know I was gonna work the rest of the day from home and take care of my nose. She's currently talking with one of my co-workers, and normally I wouldn't interrupt, but given the circumstances I came up and started with "Excuse me, boss, sorry to interrupt," but without looking up, she cuts me off and says, "You can clearly see I'm in a one-on-one, please be polite and wait for me to finish." Alright, you got it. By this time, the tissue I was using to plug my nose was getting redder and redder, and by the time she finally looked up, it wasn't a pretty sight. She asked me why I didn't say something sooner, and I just repeated back to her what she had told me. She sheepishly said obviously stuff like this would be an exception. I just shrugged and walked back to my desk to get my things. Now to the comments. So your go-to was to assume I was being rude rather than so much as looking up or letting me finish my sentence. Great, guess I know where I stand. Also, if I were the other one of that one-on-one, I'd be like, yeah, we can pick this up later. He didn't dare interrupt. You know what that boss is like. If she would have acknowledged your presence when she first spoke to you with so much as a glance, she would have seen it was an exception. OP replied, for sure. Overall, she was a decent boss, but she had a few quirks like this that eventually put kind of a strain on our relationship. Eventually I found work elsewhere. Literally all she had to do was turn her ducking head for 2 seconds. I've got a just as bad story. My sister broke her leg pretty badly, so after she came home someone always had to stay with her. Keep in mind she's 20 at this stage. 2 weeks in and she's had enough, tells everyone she'll be fine and go do what needs to be done. A couple of hours in, mum calls her and starts talking about what she's done and what she needs to do before she'll be coming home. Finally, she notices and asks, "Are you crying?" "I think I broke my arm." My sister had been quietly sobbing away waiting for mum to stop talking so she could tell her she'd broken her arm because she didn't want to be rude. Oh duck. Your poor sister. How is she doing these days? She's a broken woman. I used to be like that. I was taught to give my full attention to the people I'm speaking with, and other times, the task at hand can seem so urgent that you can't fathom the fact that anything else takes precedence. I learned from my old boss that no matter how busy you are, you should take the 10 seconds to listen to what others have to say and then judge your priorities, because it could be a real emergency. OP replied, I like your old boss. It's like all those scenes out of rom-coms or sitcoms where if one character would just let the other character explain for 10 seconds, the whole situation would be resolved. Instead, they end up saying 5 minutes later, "Now what was so important that you had to come barging in here?" only to find out the kitchen's on fire. You nearly described, beat for beat, the story of Dad trying to tell his mother the bathroom was on fire. Okay, now that we're all in the car, what did you want to tell me? The bathroom's on fire. Not to MC, but when I was in my 20s, I got nasty gash on my skull, one of many unfortunately, and I went to co-worker to ask him to take me to the hospital. I said, "Hey Dan, are you busy?" He said, "Yeah, kinda," not looking at first. And I said, "No Dan, are you busy?" Now he looks up to see my bloody face and he said, "No, not at all." Then he drove me to the hospital to get some stitches in my noggin. Dude, what was your job? Scalpers practiced on me? Once they saw me, I would have just muttered, "You have 5 days," and pass out. My son once got a nosebleed at school and then sneezed. They told me to come get him because he didn't have a clean shirt. I thought it was odd to send a kid home for a nosebleed until I saw him. He looked like a stabbing victim. I'm just imagining if you sneezed while waiting for the boss to acknowledge you. Worst story / username combo. OP replied, Lol, yeah, my username aged pretty poorly when COVID started too. Nah, it's perfect. You aiming while you sneeze means you are pointing it in a safe direction. Reminds me of a time I cut my thumb open working at Walmart. I went to every single first aid box in the store, and they were all empty. I eventually used stuff right off the shelves. When I complained to our store manager that all the first aid boxes were empty, she just said, "Oh, that sucks. From now on it's your responsibility to keep them all full. That means you'll be written up every time we get a complaint about them." She then refused to tell me how to get the stuff to fill them up. What a total witch. Walmart was the worst place I have ever worked, and I haven't had many good jobs. My wife and I got a parade stopped for us a couple years ago. She had a bad nosebleed that wouldn't stop and we were trying to get to the ER but a parade blocked our route. The cop guarding the intersection took one look at my wife and stepped into the street and blocked the parade for us. Took 2 different ERs, an ENT specialist and 5 hours to get it stopped. OP replied, "Eesh, glad she's okay." Holy cow. 5 hours to get it stopped with medical help? Dang. How did your boss and the other person not even look over at you? Like that's just a basic thing where seeing or hearing something makes you look in that direction. At least she had the decency to be ashamed of herself. OP replied, "They just didn't." Honestly, thinking about it now, I'm kinda surprised. I've never felt more unimportant than in that moment, lol. I once worked in a clothing shop, straightening shelves when a customer nearby asked a question out loud. She didn't even look at me or repeat the question, so I assumed she was talking to herself. Nope, she expected me to answer her from 5 feet away, without any attention paid to me. When I walked over and started talking to her later, she interrupted me and said since I didn't help her earlier, I didn't need to help her now, without still looking at me. Should have moved the tissue and started dripping blood onto her desk. OP replied, "The thought crossed my mind, lol." She sheepishly said obviously stuff like this would be an exception. I would have thought so too, which is why I said something, but you cut me off and told me to wait. Reminds me of that time in school, where another kid had accidentally smacked me in the face with a baseball bat. Right after it happened, I asked to go home, but it was a traumatized temp teacher who thought I was trying to take advantage of him, so he wouldn't let me go home. So I just sat there in class while my eye swelled shut and turned black. After class he profusely apologized and sent me home so my mom could take me to the emergency room. Fast forward, 20 years later I'd fall and tear my quad, literally detach it from my kneecap so it was lumped up by my hip, and the doctors told me to take an aspirin and see if it got better in the morning. Later that evening I almost passed out from pain and called emergency services again. They told me to try to take 2 aspirin instead of just 1. Next morning, I called my family doctor, who proceeded to call said emergency services and rip them a new one, as I would obviously be needing acute surgery and they'd wasted 24 hours of my 3-day optimal time frame to get fixed. Because of that delay they couldn't get a surgeon in before the weekend, and my muscle had begun to severely atrophy when they reattached it after the weekend on day 6. So instead of taking 3 months to recover, it took me upwards of a year. Last I heard was they were running an internal investigation to prevent such a case from happening again. They also told me that I should have been more demanding and insistent about my case, as if it's my fault. They assumed I was just being dramatic in the most boring, polite and down-to-earth tone of voice ever heard. PFFT. Both my parents are nurses. I learned long ago to not yell at nurses. I shouldn't be required to yell or be impolite to qualify for assistance. Well, you have to actually look at me for it to be obvious, now don't you? I know it's obviously an exception, that's why I interrupted you in the first place. It would have been obvious to you too if you had looked up. Unless you had some kind of history with providing non-urgent interruptions, this response was unwarranted.